The purple skies, perfect night. I think it's paradise when I got you here right by my side. Got no worries, got no clouds inside. Your hands in mine, let's stay the night in paradise.
So when we drove away from my city, was waving from his Chevy. Will I ever forget it? Now it's buried in my fantasy. And I don't wanna know where we two could have gone. Now it's buried in my fantasy. Chevy, will I ever forget it? Now it's buried in my fantasy. And I don't wanna know where we two could have gone. Now it's buried in my fantasy. catch me, babe. I'm falling. Come save me, baby. I'm calling. Come and be me, babe. Come as you are. Come and catch a fire, babe. Don't let me fade away. Don't let me fade away. Come and catch a feeling. It's electrifying me. Eyes wide open. I'm dreaming. Free falling, baby. Awake before I'm done. Free falling, baby. Awake before I'm done. Awake before I'm done. Awake before I'm done. Awake before free falling, baby. I need to feel love. Come hold me, babe. I need to feel love. Should be, but then you know me. I never let myself think about what you mean and us and what I need. I'd feel if that no more we, but I learned to see how without you there by my side I feel so lost, like in the dark. And I know I should have told you, and I know that it's not fair, but I want them back. All the things I never had, now that I see them fade away. How I want them back again. All the things I never had, you right in front of me, so simple to hold you and never let you go. But I never told you how I felt, thought that I could keep us the way that we used to be. But now I want it back. All the things I never had, now that I see them fade away. How I want them back again. All the things
You could do this to me when you said you love me. When you said you love me.
Welcome back, everybody. Terrific to have you here again, and a particular welcome to folks who've joined us from the Americas, from North, Central, and South America. My name is Jane Lewis. I'm one of the directors at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation based in London, and it's my very great pleasure to be hosting us through the next few hours to the close of the conference. The rest of the day is going to focus on common elements. And we first of all have a keynote by Bruce Chorpita, and that will be followed by a panel discussion. So it is an absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome and to introduce Bruce Chorpita. Many people will know Bruce as the Professor of Psychology and Professor of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the University of California in Los Angeles. In the early part of the 2000s, Bruce was the clinical director at the Hawaii Department of Health's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division. And while he was there, he led a reform initiative that doubled the effect size and the cost effectiveness of mental health outcomes for all youth served by the state system. I'm just going to say that again because I think that's a little bit special. He doubled the effect size and the cost effectiveness of mental health outcomes for all youth served by the state system. I think that's quite profound. He is a world-leading innovator in how to improve the effectiveness of mental health systems and services through treatment design, through clinical decision-making, information delivery models, and service system architecture. And he's published very, very widely on this. His work is all done very closely in partnership with community agencies delivering mental health services. And he's lead author of the MATCH ADTC protocol, which many people will know as an evidence-based treatment that outperformed multiple other treatments in 2 randomized effectiveness trials and in 3 different states. So Bruce will talk for about 35 minutes. There'll be a little bit of time at the end for your questions. You'll see on your screens to the right a live Q&A. So please do put your questions there. There's also a discussion box there. And if you run into any difficulties, there's a technical assistance portal at the top of the screen. But the session's being recorded, so you can listen to it at any time. So Bruce, it really is an enormous pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. We're really honored. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Just a small technical issue. Jane's feed for me is extremely quiet. So when we go to Q&A, there may be something to check about that. I can barely hear anything. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. And if not, someone will flag me or wave me down and stop me. You can, okay, great. Well, good morning to my friends in the US and good afternoon to my friends in Europe, and to everyone else, good night. This is a perfect thing, actually, if you're going to bed. This would be a great time to get a little bit of entertainment that's put you to sleep here. I'd like to talk a little bit about common elements and putting that in context. So the title Beyond Common Elements is really trying to say, what are we hoping to get out of this? And, you know, I love hearing the sort of the old Hawaii story is one of the things where my team and I are very proud of. And that really began in the late 90s already with some work with common elements, which we didn't even call it that at the time. We just called it learning how to do good quality therapy. And so it's been increasingly formalized over the years. But I want to see if I can put that into a more formal context, a more modern context today, and see where that takes the discussion. So just quickly, these are my disclosures, some funding and ownership interest, and we will get right into it now. So see, already I told you if you want to get put to sleep, usually when people see the words knowledge architecture, they get a little anxious here, but all we're talking about is our ability to produce knowledge. So if you're a researcher, that's your circle on the left. We store knowledge, right? We get those things published usually, and then somehow magically we are supposed to apply that knowledge. And this is true in everything we do as humans, right? We've been producing, storing, and applying knowledge for centuries, and we're getting better at some of these things. But what I would argue is that we are weakest at this link. I'll get to in a minute. Let me just tell you the statistics on children's mental health are that there are more than 1,200 randomized clinical trials testing over 2,800 psychosocial treatments. I just looked at those this morning to make sure my numbers were right. And we store these in PDFs and in journals and in treatment manuals somewhere. I've yet to meet someone who's read them all. But when you talk about applying them in systems, the very, very best systems that I've encountered, best in terms of trying to apply what's in the evidence base, use less than 5% of that knowledge, and many use far less than 1% of that knowledge. So um, we know a lot more than we are able to apply, and that problem continues to get worse because we're so good at producing new knowledge, and there are so many incentives for researchers to keep publishing papers and doing trials and things. Um, what we are missing is this ability to exploit and extract information, and that is what I would argue for my implementation science colleagues, where we need to focus is how to not pick off one little slice of the evidence base per se, but to think about ways to exploit the entire evidence base and apply it. This was a sentiment advanced by Herb Simon 50 years ago in a talk he gave in Washington, D.C. In an information-rich world, progress does not lie in the direction of reading and writing faster or storing more of it. It lies in exploiting and extracting the patterns of the world. So I'd love everyone to think about common elements as a way of extracting patterns of the world so that we know what to do and we're more informed based on everything we know. So still, this is usually where people are saying it's time for me to go get a snack. This is far too technical, not crazy about this. So uh, I thought I'd give an internet-based example that should be fairly easy for us to understand. We all know how the internet, well, none of us really knows how the internet works, right? But we all use the internet. And I think we can think about this problem in terms of how the internet works. That may help us a little bit. So how does the internet work? This is a very simplified view of that. And suppose we had a question like, how tall is a cat? So I'll make it a nice, easy question. How tall is a cat? What if you didn't know that? Well, if you go to the internet, in the early days, the internet is simply a collection of machines, and it used to be that you had to dial up a specific machine at, perhaps at University of Chicago or someplace that happens to know a lot about cats. And because all machines can connect to one another on the internet, if you knew the address of that server you wanted to get to, you might be able to find some information to answer your question. Now, this was a long time ago. This was back maybe when I was a graduate student, is how the internet worked like this. And since then, what we've gotten used to is if you want to find out information about something, we go to web pages, right? And so there's a layer of the internet now that is basically web pages and documents. And we feel like we're navigating to those things and searching for web pages, which are really, and that whole layer of machines is hidden from us now. All of these pages will reside on machines. So some machines host several pages, and some pages are pulling material from multiple servers, right? So there's a complex relationship there, and all these pages can connect to each other via various addresses. And so you might find, oh, there's a page I found that has cats on it. Maybe I should look there. But in fact, that there are many, in case you're not familiar with the internet, there are many pages about cats on the internet. So it gets to be difficult to know, well, which page is the best one to go to, right? And we use search engines and things like that. Well, what does it mean to have the semantic web? And when I say the age of semantic knowledge, what we're really trying to do is to say, I would like to have a machine read all of those web pages and just give me my answer, right? I'm interested in this blue arrow. How tall is a cat? That's all I really want to know. And this cat is, I think this cat is from New York City because it's eating pepperoni pizza. I'm not sure. But let's find out how tall a cat is. I'm going to ask my phone how tall a cat is and see what happens. How tall is a cat? And you can see, maybe you can see, there's a nice, beautiful cat. It says 9.1 to 9.8 inches, and there's no web page. It's just a picture of an adorable little cat and no web page. We just get a fact returned to us. And that fact is the fact I have here on the slide, right? I happened to ask this question earlier. And so this is really what we're interested in, right? We want answers to our questions. We don't necessarily want to sift through many, many pages. And so you're thinking, this is wonderful. I now understand the semantic web, but what does this have to do with implementation science? Well, if you think of an implementation science example, the corollary here is simply that we have many, many laboratories that you used to have to call up to find out things. And those laboratories produce many manuals and studies. And what we're interested in extracting is elements from those studies that we can act on, right? So an element, a practice element, a common element, a practice element is simply a pattern of behaviors that we can engage in that may show up on in many studies and many manuals, very much like the height of a cat is on many web pages. Okay, so that's the idea here, is moving towards a world where we can just move directly to the elements, to the facts, and be informed by those things and extract lots and lots of information from the evidence base. So how do we do that? By the way, you can try that trick on your phone, see if it works. If it does, it's now you know why it works that way. We do that using structured ontologies. And so Tom Gruber defines these as a commitment. So this is something we all have to agree to. We have to make a commitment to specifying objects and their relationships in a representative vocabulary. So it's a little bit more than sometimes people think about common elements. It's not just a vocabulary. It's not just a code book of terms, but it defines their relationships to each other and to other objects in the ontology. So how are these practices related to protocols? How are protocols related to things that went on in studies and outcomes and things like that? All of that stuff those are elements we would like to extract, right? Just like that cat example. We want to pull all that out. That is not a picture of Tom Gruber. It's just simply a picture of a man with a phone. But if you ask your phone who Tom Gruber is, you may find out why I have a picture of a cell phone. He's very well known for having invented an application that many people use on their cell phones. Okay, anyway, let's look at how we, in the work that we're doing now, deal with our representative vocabulary. This is one example, one way, and this is actually just a piece of a code system that we use to extract information not only from studies, but to extract information from live observation of therapy and supervision and planning meetings and almost any event you can imagine. So what does it have here? It has this activities. You can see these blue banners: activities, resources, problems, and solutions. I've left quite a few things out, but these are the main things to be thinking about. That almost everything that happens in mental health involves activities, resources, problems, and solutions. And we can specify nearly anything in terms of different combinations of those. For example, and those little greater than signs are simply accordions. So I blew up the diagnosis problem into 4 diagnoses. We know that there are more than 4 diagnoses in the world, but not that can fit on this slide. So I only have 4 here. But you could see there are many different syndromes you could measure that are problems, or symptoms you could measure, and we could have symptom lists that are very, very long. Those relate to diagnoses, right? We have protocol lists and practice lists and this thing called steps that I'll talk about in a minute. Many, many treatment manuals and so forth. So there's lots of different things going on here in these. But let's look at an example. So if a therapist, and these in red, these are like words from this representative vocabulary. A therapist considers diagnoses and selects a mood disorder. We typically call that assessment, right? So we have a way of describing that in a standardized language. If a therapist and supervisor monitor symptoms on a dashboard, so we have some resources and an activity and a problem, we might call that outcome monitoring, right? Looking at how someone's doing over time, maybe. If a therapist applies a protocol using a treatment manual, that was something we would call treatment, evidence-based treatment or manualized treatment, something like that. Therapist and supervisor together select a practice. Looks like they're selecting psychoeducation. We would call that planning, right? So anyway, the idea here is that we have many, many ways of describing patterns in the things that we do in clinical practice. I'm circling these here. This list here are the elements of practice at a level of abstraction of specific procedures. So that's what we call practice elements historically. And so let's look at practice elements in action a little bit. So this is an older graph here. This is what you can do. Remember, we're extracting information. So this is 72 different interventions. One of the advantages of elements, practice elements, is that you can synthesize across many protocols. So here we have 72. And if you look at them closely, you can see which ones are common. So interventions for disruptive behavior seem to often involve things like praise and a timeout procedure and a rewards procedure. And no surprise, the common ones are the ones we call common elements. Right? So that's all that really means. We really mean practice elements because, as I'll show you in a minute, there are many other elements in studies and in psychosocial treatments. But let's think about practice elements a bit more. I like to show this graph. This is from a study we recently published with Renad Betis and Kelsey Okamura, former RA in my lab, who went out and worked in Philadelphia with Renad, and other friends of mine out here on this paper. And what I like to think of this as, it's a little bit narcissistic, but I like to think of this graph here as disruptive behavior protocols over my lifetime. So it starts right around when I was born. I'm not going to say which year, but right around when that x-axis begins is when I was born. And as you can see, when I turned to be about 4 or 5 years old, that dotted line shows that the number of practice elements for disruptive behavior rapidly increased. Fortunately for my parents, they had some skills available. Over more than 20 practices were available to manage my behavior during the 70s. And by the time I got out of grad school, I was about here. And you can see that the number of protocols or treatment manuals was higher than the number of practices, right? So treatment manuals simply representing many different combinations of the same practices. And then by the time we published this paper, there haven't really been a lot of new practice elements for disruptive behavior, but there are many, many treatment manuals out there. So this paper was published not too long ago, but I checked this week, and as of this week, we're more like where these red lines go. We now have over 500 protocols for disruptive behavior, but we only have about 50 practices in those manuals. So what does this have to do with what I've been talking about so far? Again, think of it as like we're making many, many, many web pages, but the facts about cats are not really growing, right? So it's really actually increasing our problem in some ways of being able to extract information. We have more sources, but not a lot, at least in terms of practices. Now, there is a lot of new information in these studies, generalizing to new contexts, new order to things, new populations, and so forth. But in terms of practices, not a whole lot new since I got out of college, basically. All right, so we do want to focus on that elements part. So what am I going to tell you about now? I'm going to switch gears and say, what do we do if we can extract all this? What does it look like if we can put it into action and actually make a system? So I'm going to talk to you about another RCT number 2881, a randomized clinical trial we just finished in my laboratory and at the University of South Carolina with my co-PI Kim Becker. We were doing a study on trying to keep kids from dropping out of therapy called Reaching Families. And the Reaching Families study is interesting because we built what we call a knowledge appliance which is a way of extracting all of the practice elements from every randomized trial having to do with treatment dropout, engagement, and things like that. And what we did was we did a community focused implementation, and we wanted to see whether folks could use this application to change the way they practice with kids who are at risk of dropping out. So just in terms of the structure of the study, there were two conditions. Cluster randomized trial. So we randomized supervisor teams, 118 therapists and 34 supervisors in two states, California and South Carolina in the US. Those two conditions were a practice guidelines group, which was actually a common elements group. So our control group was common elements using the 12 to 15 most common practices for keeping kids from dropping out of therapy. And our experimental condition was something we call the coordinated knowledge system, which is a tool that not only gives people the practice elements, but it gives you some of those other things I showed you earlier. It structures those activities, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment. We screened over 1,300 students. About half of those were at risk, and for a variety of reasons with calendar and everything else, a subset was about 580 were eligible, and we invited 367 and 231 students participated. We audio recorded supervision and therapy sessions, and we coded over 1,200 clinical study events, transcribed them, translated them. Most of them are in Spanish here in Los Angeles. We have over 20,000 excerpts and counting, and close to 40,000 codes now applied to these different events. So the study aim was to take this appliance and say, and look at these words in yellow, they come from that vocabulary I was telling you about earlier. Each one of those is a reserved word now. So we were trying to structure activities and resources, meaning supervisors, therapists, and their materials, to encourage coordinated and strategic consideration, selection, and application of practices fitting the problem as supported by the evidence base across supervision and therapy events. That's kind of a mouthful, but that's what it takes to be able to code this out and see, is this really happening? So in plain language, we're trying to get supervisors and therapists to use evidence-based practice elements for children at risk of dropping out of therapy. That's all we're really trying to do. So remember this, this set of definitions here. We're going to focus on a few of them. So you can see I lit up some labels, the problems and practices we want to look at. And then those activities, considering, selecting, and applying are specific defined activities we're going to take a closer look at. So let's put those into a flow. So you see a little animation here. So if you think about considering what might the problem be? Why is this child interested in dropping out? And then selecting which problem do I want to work on? That's sort of the assessment phase. And then considering what practices I might use. Well, what should I do about that? And then selecting one. This is the one I want to do next time I see this child. That's the planning phase that you can see. So it says plan practice. And then, of course, we want to apply that practice and see if we can use it with a child. So what I'm going to show you is a tree. Well, this, by the way, this is in this assessing and planning happens in supervision, and then the application, of course, happens in treatment. And I'm going to put this into a space here that we're going to build a tree from left to right, showing you how people step through these different actions or activities in this sequence, right? And so you can imagine, oh, good practice would look like I consider engagement problems, I select one, I consider all relevant evidence-based engagement-focused procedures, practice elements, and then I select one and then I use it, right? That seems like pretty straightforward. And that is the application problem, right? That's the big problem we're all trying to solve in implementation science. These conditions, again, practice guidelines, which was based on elements, and then this coordinated knowledge system, which was based on elements, but used specific tools to help folks structure this, this sequence of activities, let's say. All right, so we need to know about certain colors here. Green means that somebody was doing something engagement focused. Remember, this is an engagement study. If you were not doing engagement focused activity, you were not really working on the problem. everyone was told their child is at risk of dropping out. So, and then if the branch of the tree is white, it means the step literally wasn't performed at all, not even on a non-engagement focused problem or practice. So a non-engagement focused problem might be like depression, let's say. All right, so in the first branch, we're off and running here, and you can see that this coordinated knowledge system condition had 100% of folks considering engagement problems in supervision, whereas in the supervision control group, the practice guidelines group, only 68% of folks were even considering engagement problems to work on. Nearly all of the rest were considering non-engagement focused things, and then one group wasn't considering anything. That little tiny branch down at the very bottom is like a tiny white slice, maybe you can see it. Now these all branch again, and we see that 100% of the intervention group selected an engagement problem to work on, as opposed to 43% of the practice guidelines group. So you can see already there's some drop off at each of these steps right away in the supervision as usual kind of group. So usually then once we've selected a practice in supervision, a problem, sorry, in supervision, I want to work on the fact that this child has a bad relationship with me, or this child doesn't understand therapy and that's why she doesn't want to keep coming, or the homework is too difficult, right? You select a problem and now you consider what are the evidence-based practices to address that problem. Let's take a look at that. And we see 91% versus across a bunch of different branches, we see 21% of folks in the practice guidelines group considering evidence-based engagement-focused practices. Well, let's go to the select phase now and see, usually we go from that to saying, well, among those we're considering, which one do we want to do in the next treatment session? And that looks like this. So we'll pause for a moment and say, for starters, as you can see, one meta message here is that thinking about implementation success means we may have to think about supervision a lot more, because look how easily people go off the path in supervision without some kind of appliance or structure or guideline or guardrails. We like to think of these as guardrails in a way. Because in the diversity of activity, there are 26 different branches to the tree in the control group. So 26 different ways people arrived at selecting a plan. Whereas there are only 5 branches, I believe, or 6 in the other group, sorry, 6 branches. And most of that activity is taken up by one big branch, right? Which is people selecting an evidence-based procedure for engagement. So that looks pretty good, like we're likely to get some success here. And so hold on, because what you're about to see is going to surprise you. We're now going to look at treatment, and we're going to see who used engagement practices in treatment. And when we look at this, you're going to say, holy smokes, you just had me convinced that supervision really, really matters. And now I don't think supervision matters at all, because look how green everything is. This is great. People just do good stuff whenever. Well, not so much. I'll tell you why that's green in a moment. But what we want to do is apply one higher standard. So this is, 89% green, 89% engagement focused activity in one group versus 72% in the other. But I'll tell you why that's green by changing our menu a little bit. So if you look at the menu, I've added a dark green. And what this means, and then if you look at the top of the slide there, it says select in dark green. So what this means is, did people pick an engagement focused practice that actually fit the problem they selected? So in other words, if the problem is, I have a poor therapeutic alliance or poor relationship with this youth, that I select an evidence-based procedure for fixing the relationship as opposed to for fixing homework or transportation or some other barrier to engagement. And when we apply that standard in supervision, we see 72 or 70% in the consider and select phases versus 1% in supervision. So even when people are picking engagement practices, they're not picking ones that fit the child they're talking about, right? And so naturally that carries over when we go to treatment. We see a difference, 47% of people in our intervention group applied and used a practice that was appropriate from the evidence base and fit the child 47% of the time. In the control group, it was 0% of the time. So why is there all that green? That is simply because when what people did in the control group was they did relationship building, right? So they just were nice and friendly. And when you're nice and friendly, that's actually an engagement procedure called relationship building, but it didn't happen to fit the problem that they were facing, right? Um, so 47%, we're humbled by that in a way. There's still some ways to go, but when you look at where we are with supervision as usual, we're starting from a baseline of 0. People are not using evidence-based procedures. Okay, so so the reason I show that example is because I kind of took the practice element layer out of that, and we were really focusing on activities above practice elements, like what elements do we apply, which ones do we monitor, which ones do we select and consider. So I wanted to show, again, in terms of beyond common elements, that there are these other layers of things that are going on that we can extract in an ontology or extract in a standardized vocabulary and extract patterns. The other way I want to go is to look at practices a little bit more closely. Let's talk about, and then we're going to go inside practices and say, like, are there things within practices? So let's look at the practices from this trial first. This wheel here basically shows you the red was the control group again, and the blue was the CKS group. And the middle band is just one of those activities called applying practice, right? That's from our code system. And then you see the outer band is the practices applied. So just as I said earlier, in the control group, most of what was going on is relationship or rapport building. The majority of the practices applied in our study in the control group were some kind of rapport building activity. Whereas you can see in the intervention group, there's a wide variety of evidence-based procedures, positive expectation setting, goal setting, motivational enhancement, addressing barriers, psychoeducation, right? So there's a great variety and a much more even and broad distribution of practices that were applied in therapy. So that's really nice. And if we wanted to look closer at that, I'd like to argue that practice elements aren't the final stopping point. Practice elements are nice when you're making decisions at the level of practices. What should I do next week? But suppose you're making decisions at an even more granular level, like within a treatment event. You might want to look at something within practice elements. So let's see how that's organized. We're going to stack these engagement elements into a column. And what I'll show you is that there are things that we call steps. It's not a particularly special name, but usually there's steps on a guide that you follow. So we call them steps for now. And as you can see, the steps I have listed here in yellow on the right, you can't read all these, but don't worry, I'll blow them up for you. The steps on the right are unique to those practices, right? So there's this one-to-many relationship between the practices and the steps. A step belongs to one and only one practice, but that's not true of all steps. So on the left, I'm going to show you more steps that have relationships with many practices. So those are you might call those common steps, the way we talk about common elements. Those are things like the very first one on the upper left, you might not be able to see it, but it says provide rationale. Well, provide rationale shows up in a lot of practices. It's a good idea, it turns out, to explain to people what you're doing and why. So that tends to show up a lot. Assign homework, use praise, things like that. So that's what's on the left, common steps. So let's take a look at how steps or sub-elements might be useful for us to think about. And this is just a little examination here. I just pulled some data together. So we're going to look at goal setting. And it turns out goal setting has its unique steps are in the middle or the working phase of the flow. And then we have some common steps on the top and bottom, like, you review the homework, you give the rationale, you see how the family is doing. And then there are these kind of practice-specific steps, like discuss what an effective goal looks like, consider possible goals to work on and prioritize them. And then we make a plan, like assign homework. We express optimism about, I think you can do this homework. And then you say, I'm going to ask you about the homework next time, right? So that's what goal setting might look like if it was reduced to 9 steps. And what's interesting is that we looked in our study at sort of a high integrity and low integrity versions of goal setting that emerged, right? There's a lot of variation. And you can say someone did an extensive or less extensive version of goal setting. But we then wanted to look at that in terms of these steps. And so I'll put these, if you wanted to know, was a step covered in the high integrity or high extensiveness goal setting, you can see that the blue bars represent, they go all the way out to 100%. So some steps were covered 100% of the time these practices were used. The goal setting practice was used. These steps were performed. Whereas in the less extensive or low integrity examples of goal setting, you can see those percentages are much, much lower. And in fact, on the core steps that are part of this practice element, you can see some pretty big opportunities for improvement here. Almost nobody prioritized goals. And look at that first one, discuss characteristics of effective goals. So a lot of people did goal setting and didn't even discuss what are good goals, what are good types of goals to set, right? So again, just an example of how to extract patterns. And as I was telling you before, you know, that missing link in our knowledge architecture is looking for opportunities to improve things, and not just at a we need new protocol level or we need to implement a completely new protocol and get people using it perfectly, but getting into these elements and even sub-elements across events, supervision events, treatment events, planning events, phone calls to home. We even code phone calls. And looking at how are we doing in terms of producing the expected practices that fit the patterns we see in the literature, in this vast, vast literature that we've been developing. So I'm going to wrap up here and just say there's more. So the message I want to leave us with today, because I know this is the theme for this wrap up session and the panel to follow, is about elements. And so I want to hit on that theme that there is more retrievable knowledge in the evidence base if we can distill out the patterns. And that's really what we're trying to do with elements. And again, I think we want to look not only at those elements, but we want to look at other activities as well. We know from almost any other field, and in fact, psychology, I would say, is much farther behind than other areas, like nursing, for example, in terms of using ontologies to extract information from the evidence base and applying the evidence base. So we could take some lessons from other disciplines and how to do this a little better. If we can do this, and I know the National Academy of Sciences is looking at this now in terms of trying to promote the use of ontologies in behavioral science, it will be possible to wield more information so more of the evidence in more ways. And much like you can ask your phone a question, we should be able to ask a device or an appliance a question about what we do next, whether it's in supervision or in treatment, right? So that is the future we're envisioning. We should be able to build these high precision knowledge appliances that guide what we do, keep us from going off the path the way you saw in supervision there. And then I like to say, and you know, when I'm in front of an implementation science audience, and I wish I could see all of you, I'm really actually just in my guest room, my house right now, and I can't see anyone, but I'm imagining someone is out there. I like to make this point that we talk a lot about trying to implement the evidence base or implement protocols from the evidence base, and I want us to continue to think about imagining an evidence base that implements itself. So how do we organize the evidence base in a way that gets to us as easily as knowing how tall a cat is, right? So we know what to do in various situations. If it's been studied, it should be as easy to get to as that question was for us today. That's the future we should be building as implementation scientists. So I will stop there and take any questions. These are my references and contact information. And I'm going to stop my screen share and see if anyone has questions for me at this time. Thank you.
Bruce, that has just been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so very much. I hope you can hear me a little more clearly.
Perfect. Yeah, that's much
Good.
better. Yeah.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks, tech folks, for sorting that. That was just absolutely wonderful. Just the most elegant simplicity brought to such a very complex topic area. And your data is so powerful, and I think really helps to illustrate how you managed to achieve the kinds of effects that you did achieve in Hawaii and have done since. Thank you so much. One of the questions that I wanted to put to you in the short amount of time that we've got left is about how your work helps practitioners to combine elements when more than one, when a family or a young person presents with a range of different conditions or priorities that perhaps change over time, and how your approach helps a practitioner to make sound decisions about what to address, how to address it, how much time to spend on it, and when to move on to something else.
Well, I love that question, and because I think that's where the action is. I think we know what the elements are, right? As you saw from that earlier graph, they haven't changed very much over 50 years. And where the action is knowing which ones to pick and knowing how to know whether they're working. So it's like in this recent trial that we've been doing, we focus much more on that overarching structure of first considering the problem. So believe it or not, the answer to that, how do we know what practice to pick, starts with making sure we know what the problem is. And when we study folks in various situations, we sometimes find people don't talk about the problem, or they don't even necessarily have consensus and supervision on the problem before they start thinking about practices. And what we see in our data across many, many things we've looked at is that practice selection often reflects what is most comfortable and familiar. And I don't mean people are just trying to take it easy, but I mean, people, all things being equal, people will select a procedure that they have repeated to the point of being very smooth at it and very skilled at it, right? We like to do something we already know how to do. And when we do graphs of pattern use and usual care, we see like three, it's like a scree plot. You see like three practices that get used all the time by people, and then everything else barely gets looked at. And so the question becomes, how do we get out of that pattern of just using the same three practices for everything? Well, you have to consider what the problem is. You have to select a specific problem to work on, as you saw. And then we build tools to help people know these are the best, most appropriate practices to select. And if you have to do more than one, where's the evidence base doesn't do that very often. So you don't see many instances of two procedures at the same time. So we would tend to say you have to prioritize. That's why we have that step, or that activity rather. Select the practice you want to use first. So you might have several on deck, but our approach would typically be to prioritize one, use it. What I didn't show you, the other activities that would follow that treatment session are monitor, did it work? If it didn't work, then you go back to your selected few appropriate fitting treatments, and you continue to work through. Or, so you could switch practices. The other thing you can do, as I showed you with the goal setting, is to say, maybe I'm not doing goal setting right. And it's not about adding more practices, but it's about fixing the one that I'm using. But you can see how this creates that context, right? For us to it's suddenly structure wielding the entire evidence base is simply what we're trying to do. So anyway, that's a great question. I see we have about a minute left, so.
I won't even attempt another question. We could have done with another 5 or 6 hours of your time, Bruce. That has just been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, and you've given us so much to reflect on and pick up on further in the panel that follows, which I'll just very quickly say will be chaired